Hi, everyone. My name is Agon Hamza, and as always, I'm here with my friend and colleague, Frank Ruda, my co-host of Crisis and Critique podcast, Philosophy and Its Other Scene. After the summer break, we are very happy and excited to return with our autumn season, in which we'll have another set of discussion with series of distinguished guests and interlocutors. But before introducing our guest for today, I would like to mention a few things. First, Frank and I would like to remind you that the last issue of Crisis and Critique, published just over a month ago, is devoted to the new right. We encourage you to take a look at it. We really believe it is very timely. And the next issue for this year will be published in about 2 months' time. Second thing is that we would like you to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels. And if you'd like the work that we are doing both with the journal and the podcast, please consider supporting us at our Patreon page. You'll find everything in the description below. And now back to our guest, whom I have the great pleasure of introducing. Frank and I are very excited to welcome Yanis Varoufakis to Crisis and Critique podcast. Yanis Varoufakis is a Greek economist, academic, politician, and former finance minister in the Syriza government in what was probably the most critical and crucial period of Greece in the post-dictatorship period. He resigned from Alexis Tsipras' government a day after the infamous referendum in which the Greek people gave a resounding no to the bailout program. His tenure as a finance minister, and especially the negotiating process with the Troika, has been described in his book, Adults in the Room, My Battle with European Deep Establishment. Born in Athens, he was for many years a professor of economics in Britain, Australia, and the United States of America before he entered politics, serving in Greek parliament until May 2023, I believe. He is currently professor of economics at the University of Athens and is a co-founder. I think he currently serves as a Secretary General of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. Yanis, correct me if I'm wrong about this. He is the author of many books and papers, and here we will mention only a few. Game Theory, A Critical Introduction, published in 1995. Modern Political Economics, Making Sense of the Post-28 World, co-authored with Joseph Halevi and Nicholas Theotsarakis. I hope I pronounced this well. The Global Minotaur, America, Europe, and the Future of Global Economy, published in 2015. And The Weak Suffer What They Must, Europe's Crisis, America's Economic Future, in 2016. Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment, in 2017. Talking to My Daughter About Economy, 2017. Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Program, and his latest, Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism, about which we will talk and discuss in just a little bit. Varoufakis was also a subject to a 6 documentary series titled In the Eye of the Storm, The Political Odyssey of Yanis Varoufakis, directed by Raul Martinez. It was released earlier this year, I believe. His book, Adults in the Room, served as a basis for a film directed by the famous Greek director, Kostas Gavras, under the same title, released in 2019. Varoufakis is not a philosopher, and perhaps he should consider himself lucky for this. So who is to say which vocation is more impossible? An economist and university professor who, to use his words, happened to speak a bit too much and too often about financial crisis of 2028 and Greek crisis, and thus found himself in politics. It is our pleasure to be discussing about all these domains with him today. And with this, I will hand things over to my friend Frank to start off with the conversation. Yanis, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Agon. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Thank you, Yanis, also from my side. And we would like to begin from a slightly sideways point of view. We were wondering what kinds of role the concept of the family plays for you and for your work. I mean, in some of your books, we're here thinking of you're talking to my daughter about the economy, or how capitalism works and how it fails, but also about the most recent techno-feudalism. Your argument is framed as an address to a member of your family. In one of it, you are addressing your daughter. The other takes the form of a long letter addressed to your father who passed away before you finished the book. Both books thereby bring to the fore a certain, let's say, transgenerational dimension of your work. Can we therefore ask you, what is family to you? We ask this also because the family is not only a transgenerational social form, a social form which brings generations together, even though it clearly is this as well, but it also has been co-adapted and has become a primary bourgeois form. This is part of the famous argument Friedrich Engels made in The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, right? I mean, it organizes, the production of wealth, the hierarchy between men and women, and labor divisions, and so forth. So what role does the family play for you? And maybe we could say today, so in today's capitalism, do you think, or in today's techno-feudalism, do you think it will last as an elementary form of social organization and reproduction, or will at least some dimension of it last?
Well, Frank, you're putting me in a very difficult spot because, I've always been, a traditional Marxist or Engelsist who always used to think that, family is the worst thing that can happen to one. Friends and comrades you choose, family you don't choose. And, I always considered, when people were saying to me, especially men, that they're dying to reproduce, to have kids, I was saying, my God, this is the beginning of Nazism, the predominance of DNA reproduction. And now you just reminded me, or actually pointed out to me, this genuinely, I hadn't thought of that until now, that the two books that I addressed particular persons, one is to my daughter and the other is to my father. Okay, now let me tell you why I did that. Not so much why did I address it to members of my family, but why did I write them in the forms of long letters? Well, primarily because I am inflicted by the malady of being an academic. So we academics are dead boring. And when I broke away from academia and I wrote these books for the general public, it was impossible for me to essentially escape the academic language until I came up with this trick, essentially, of imagining that I'm trying to explain capitalism to my then 12-year-old daughter, who is my worst critic, who thinks that I'm dead boring anyway. And, I wrote that book without a single ism, a single reference to any complicated, complex theory or theorist for that matter. And when I started writing the book on Techno-Feudalism, my latest book, I thought, okay, if I try to write a book on what I think this new form of cloud capital is doing to the world we live in, I will revert back to my academic language. No, I can't afford to do that. So my father had just died. So he was the man who introduced me, the person who introduced me to capitalism at a ridiculously young age, as a communist himself, a Marxist. So I thought, okay, well, I've got to write this as a letter to my dad. So it wasn't so much that he was my DNA, it was that he was the man who introduced me to capitalism. But having said that, now this is a revelation. I'm about to finish a new book. It should be finished by the end of this week, if I'm going to meet my deadline. And this really puts me into the thick of what you said, because this is entitled 5 Women, and they are my mother, my father's mother, my mother's mother, my daughter's maternal great-grandmother, and my partner. So what does this mean? Yeah, and it's exactly what, as you put it, I hadn't thought of it. You focused my mind on this when you said that it's intergenerational. I have all these women because it's my way of writing a memoir without meaning it. So through these women, I tell the story of the century from 1923, which is the moment when my father's mother, my grandmother, whom I never met, got out of a Cairo nunnery, or actually a boarding school run by nuns, as an 18-year-old, and joined the feminist movement in Cairo, Egypt, 1923, and finishes 2023. So again, I'm trying to tell a story through this intergenerational bunch of members of my family, which makes me feel very, after your question, very insecure, because what happened to my Friedrich Engels kind of antipathy towards DNA?
About a decade ago, you gave a keynote at Subversive Festival in Zagreb, Croatia. It was titled Confessions of an Heretic Marxist. Interestingly, the text cannot be found online, although there's a whole series of responses and critique of it. So we are trying to dig into our memory and want to ask you to reconstruct some of your arguments. If I remember correctly, you discussed the discrepancy or antagonism between what you elaborated in your doctoral thesis. I think it was titled On Optimization and Strikes, no?
Yeah.
And the world we live in. And then you went back to read Marx, so to speak. However, you indicated, I think in that talk, and also in the Techno-Feudalism, that you found that Marx paradoxically had already informed the way you saw the world before you sort of actually read him. Is that true? Was there a form of what we may call spontaneous Marxism in your stance? What did you find when you returned to Marx, so to speak?
No, I don't think it's true, Agon.
Okay.
What I was saying, well, maybe I didn't make it explicitly clear. By the way, that speech, an abbreviated version of it, but quite substantial, was published by The Guardian with the same title, Confessions of an Heretic Marxist, in later when I became famous. That's, well, that's what The Guardian does. But so you can find it, the essence of it is there, is in The Guardian. No, look, I read Marx before I read anything else. I started reading Marx when I was 11. The tradition of Greek rebelliousness against the fascist dictatorship in which I grew up. My father's experiences. I mean, I was an activist from a very young age. And Marx was the first economist I ever read, years and years before I went to university. And I have to tell you that when I went to university and I read conventional economics, mainstream economics, I was so bored that I dropped it. And I didn't even get an economics degree. And then I did a master's in mathematics, and I thought I had escaped economics until when I was looking for a dissertation topic, I accidentally came across an article in the American Economic Review on industrial strikes, on the clash between employers and trade unions, in which, it was a very highly mathematical article. And this is why I read it, because I was a mathematician by the time. And it portrayed, there was an optimization model, a model where the employer, the capitalist, is rational, forward-looking, hyper-rational, and the trade union are stupid, resisting mechanically. And so this was the way that the model was constructed, the mathematics. And then he had empirical evidence supporting this. And then he ended up saying, see, we have just proven that workers are stupid and capitalists are smart. More or less. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but this is more or less what it meant. And I got really furious. So I sat down as a mathematician to debunk the mathematics and to debunk the statistics. And that got published. And suddenly I had offers from economics departments. And I learned mainstream economics by teaching it because I couldn't bear reading it. So my background, I wasn't at all a spontaneous Marxist. I was a Marxist from way back, who then delved into economics. But you see, the thing is, once you get into academia, not just today, but since the late 1970s, there was a time when you could get into academia as a Keynesian, a Marxist, a non-mainstream economist. Not after the end of Bretton Woods and Thatcher's and Reagan's rise, it was impossible. The only way to make it as an economist was to write in the language of mainstream economics, that, in other words, in a mathematical language, which assumes there is no capitalism, in order to create a model that justifies capitalism. This is the beautiful dialectical Hegelian twist. So, to make it in that world, to get a job, to get promoted, to be considered a bona fide economist, you have to write in that language. So the way I did it, I used Marxian immanent criticism. So instead of attacking the way in which mainstream economists built economic models and their assumptions, I could have done that. I used to do it too, but not professionally. Because if you do that, if you go to an academic economy, if you go to let's say to a Newtonian physicist, and you attack the assumptions of Newton, 5 minutes later, the Newtonian physicist is not going to pay attention to you. But if you show him or her, usually him, that within his own set of assumptions of axioms, there is a contradiction that he's interested. So this is, I built a whole academic career, right? Debunking economics by pointing out its inner ambiguity, its inner contradiction, logical contradiction. And then in the footnotes, I would put my Marxist analysis in the footnotes, because nobody reads the footnotes, so that I could get away with it. So, no, I was not I was completely committed. I knew what I was doing. And I knew that, the only way of upsetting economists as a Marxist is to get one of those positions, to get established as an academic mainstream economist, and then say that around and say, you know what, Marx is new, you don't. That's what it was. It was like being an atheist who wants to become a bishop in order to debunk Christianity. That's what I was, a fifth columnist. But when I wrote that article and gave that speech where we met in Zagreb, I had one very focused objective. And I was talking to Marxists, essentially, who had not been through the agony that I had been through trying to get established in economics, in the economics mainstream. Remember, this was 2012, 2013, something like that. For me, 2008 was our generation's 1929. And after that, we were staring in the face of a postmodern 1930s with the rise of fascism and so on, which we see now everywhere. And what I wanted to do was to alert fellow Marxists that this is not the time to play games with fascism. What do I mean by that? It was clear that, unfortunately, 2008 caught the left completely unprepared. Even though it was clear that this was a major catastrophe for capitalism, right? It was a collapse of capitalism. Financialized Western capitalism collapsed in one day, and it had to be resuscitated by states. Nevertheless, we of the left were not ready to replace capitalism with socialism. As our Syriza experience in government proved, we weren't even ready to confront bankers who demanded state bailouts at the expense of the reproducibility of Greek society. And the one message I had was, since we cannot, as we speak, immediately after our generation's 1929 institute socialism, it is important to stabilize capitalism, because the complete chaos after 1929 didn't lead to socialism, it led to fascism. So progressives should go into an alliance with bourgeois thinkers like Keynes, for instance, a modern Keynes, if such a figure existed, in order to stabilize capitalism, not because we want to save capitalism, but because the continued destabilization of capitalism would bring in fascism. And I very much fear that, that was, in the end, confirmed. Our failures, both to stabilize capitalism and to bring socialism, brought on a fascist onslaught, the fascist international, from Trump to Modi to Orban to Le Pen to Macron now, because fascism has penetrated social democracy, the center-right, Trump, and so on and so forth. As for the title, erratic Marxist? Well, you see, the point I wanted to make to Marxists is, guys, forget the tradition of the 20th century. It was a disaster for Marxists. Marx was erratic. Marx changed his mind every day. Not every day, every week. He would often say, I read this thing I wrote 2 weeks ago and I thought this was crap. Right? Now, whereas many of my friends, especially the Communist Party and so on, they had a kind of Christian dogmatic approach to the texts, as if the texts, there was a continuity of texts from, the philosophical manuscripts, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, all the way to the last edict coming from the Politburo of the party, as if it was one steady flow of consistent thinking. So that's why I was stressing that I was an erratic Marxist, because it's the only way of being a Marxist.
Thank you so much, Yanis, for this. And I just a quick comment. I think Marx as a signifier is still problematic in today's academia, unless one academizes him somehow. In philosophy, basically, you say it's just Aristotelianism, and then you're fine, because then it's about normative conduct and things like that, and then you can get a job. Otherwise, if you radicalize Marx too much, it becomes immediately, I think, problematic. But you already answered, I think, at least parts of the question we wanted to raise when you spoke about immanent critique and Marx's own non-dogmatic approach to his own theory and his own development. Namely, we wanted to ask you if you see a continued relevance of Marx for the contemporary situation, that also transformed itself historically. So in the sense, do you think there is a way of staying faithful to Marx and nevertheless maybe supplementing Marx if that needs to be done due to historical, due to systemic or conceptual, or maybe even due to political reasons? So we wanted to raise the question, what do you see a relevance still for the analysis of techno-feudalism that comes from Marx's work?
Well, thank you for the question. It gives me the opportunity to say that I am a Marxist and nothing but a Marxist. And for me, the question is very interesting and nuanced, but if the foundation of my answer is that I can only make sense of the world I live in through a Marxist lens, okay? Now, there are other thinkers whose ideas have influenced me, like Marx was influenced by everyone, Adam Smith to, theatrical plays, to ancient mythology, to art, to whatever. That's Marxism for you. But this book that you mentioned, my last book, Techno-Feudalism, for me, it is, this may be misinterpreted as me being completely up myself, but I tried to write a book which I thought Marx would have written today if he looked at big tech. So it's a purely Marxist analysis, or is for you to judge whether it's crap or decent, and whether it's qualified to be seen as a Marxist analysis. But I intended it as a Marxist analysis. So I look at all my categories, especially if you look at there is an appendix in which I look at the political economy of techno-feudalism, and I start from Marx. I start with all the categories of Marx, and then I say, okay, now what happens if I'm right that capital has now created, it has mutated into a new form, which I call cloud capital. Instead of being just a produced means of production, now it's a produced means of behavioral modification, which is what these algorithms are. They're not producing anything, they are modifying behavior. They are produced means of modifying behavior. They're not rhetoric. This machinery, so it's capital. It's a capital stock. I say it's cloud capital because it's modifying behavior, not producing value itself. And it is being used by the owners of this cloud capital in order to cream off surplus value, which is still produced by the proletarians in the physical, old-fashioned capitalist world. So this is a purely Marxist analysis. And of course, as I said, there is no question of borrowing ideas and enriching the mindset through other people, especially our enemies. I take a lot of ideas from Friedrich von Hayek, from Kuznets, from von Mises. When Hayek, I remember he left an indelible mark on my conscience. I saw him once talk at the LSE many years ago. And he made his point about the power, the divine power of markets, not only to serve given preferences, but to create them. And he said, today I went into a shop and I bought something I didn't think I wanted. And he uses it as an example of why central planning can't work. And I think he was completely right as to why central planning, Gosplan style, couldn't work. But in the same way. And I think that's what Marx would have teased out. It points out that you don't need the market to perform the market miracle in a world where you have Amazon's algorithm, because Amazon's algorithm is doing this. Without them, it's not the Amazon, I say, is not a market. And I think this is a radical Marx perspective. Amazon is Gosplan that is privately owned and run beautifully through an algorithm, which Gosplan would have loved to have. And if the Soviets had it, maybe the world would have been different now. So there you are.
To remain with your latest book for a little bit more. So your thesis is that capitalism transformed itself and has evolved into something else, into another system. You claim that the two pillars, so to speak, of capitalism, that is primitive accumulation, exploitation, do no longer exist. We've moved from ownership of the land, this is feudalism which relies on rent, to ownership of the means of production, that is post-French Revolution capitalism, which established a regime of profit production, to a new feudal order, which relies on another type of rent. So we have come to a full circle and now again shifted from profit to rent. So to formulate this rather naively, what killed capitalism?
Capital. That's, the Hegelian dialectic at work. Capital killed capitalism. It wasn't the left. It wasn't you and me. It wasn't the socialists who imagined that, along with Marx, that the next stage of development, of evolution of the socio-economic mode of production, from feudalism we would go to capitalism, from capitalism we would go to socialism. I wish that were the case. It didn't. Now, look, one correction to your interpretation of my narrative, and then I'll move on. I'm not saying that we've gone back to feudalism. From capitalism, we went to a next step of to the socio-economic mode of production that came after capitalism, so forward. However, this, what I call techno-feudalism, has many of the, it has revived the role of rent. You correctly point this out, but it's not that we've gone back to rent, because this is a completely different rent. You see, under feudalism, you collected rents courtesy of having been born in the right family. You didn't need to do anything. You didn't need to invest in anything. You just inherited the land, and that title deed allowed you to collect rent from the peasants, to take a cut of the production. And that's it. When I talk about techno-feudalism today, there are lots of people, especially those who are besotted with, the magic of big tech and the big tech bros and so on, who say to me, but Yanis, how can you possibly make any comparison between the landed gentry of feudalism and Jeff Bezos? Jeff Bezos has invested huge quantities of money. He's an entrepreneur. He's a capitalist, whereas the landed gentry were not. That's correct. That is correct. But the point I'm making is that even though Jeff Bezos is indeed the epitome of a capitalist, a man who's invested other people's money, because this is what, Henry Ford did. This is what Thomas Edison did. They never invested their own money. They invested other people's money, but they invested their money in capital goods, in machinery. So did Zuckerberg. There are huge server farms, all this machinery, including the algorithms, the software, and so on and so forth. But the difference is that even though you could say that there's a lot of concentrated capital, take Henry Ford on the one hand, or Thomas Edison, or Westinghouse, and then Jeff Bezos or Zuckerberg on the other side. And so, but this is where the similarity ends and the chasm, the gigantic difference begins. Henry Ford, he even bought a newspaper in order to convince you that the state should not touch him, right? Bezos bought the Washington Post. So there are similarities there. The fundamental, profound difference that I think only a Marxist can really grasp is that Henry Ford did all this to sell you his cars. The product that was coming out of the production line. He was making stuff, not him, his workers. He was, essentially quick marching lots of technologists, engineers, and proletarians to produce the Model T. And he wanted everyone to buy a Model T. And he was leaning on governments to get rid of public transport so that everybody would buy a Model T. What is Jeff Bezos interested in you buying? He doesn't give a shit about what you buy, as long as you buy it on Amazon.com. So he's created a fiefdom, a digital fief, I call it, or a cloud fief, because he lives in the cloud. Okay, he uses it in order to replace the marketplace, to concentrate, to turn it into a trading platform. It's a trading platform, it's not a market. And it's not a market because markets always require a degree of decentralization. Yeah, a degree of decentralization. But this is completely centralized, it's Gosplan. The algorithm selects you and matches you with a particular seller. And you have no chance of talking to that seller or to other buyers, okay, or sellers between talking to one another, unless the algorithm deems it in the interest of Jeff Bezos for you to do so. In other words, never. Okay. So what does it do? How does it work? He doesn't produce anything. He simply takes the surplus value from 2 quarters. Bezos collects 40% of the price you pay, 30%, to the capitalist who is selling his stuff on Amazon.com. He gets 30-40% effectively. He skims off the profits. So the surplus value that the capitalist has amassed by exploiting proletarian labor in a factory is now transferred to the bank account of Jeff Bezos. So that's one source of his rent. And I call this a cloud rent. It's like a big, charging for access to this digital or cloud land, cloud fief, as I call it. But then at the same time, because we do things on those platforms, they get, these big tech brothers, they get from us free labor. Every time we post something, we post a review on Amazon.com, we post a picture or a video or something, as you do with your podcast, like as I do with my podcasts. We're adding to the capital stock, to the cloud capital of these cloudalists. I call them cloudalists, by the way, they're capitalists, but they are cloud capital owners, and therefore I call them cloudalists for brevity. So this is the very thing about this that has never happened before in the history of capitalism. We produce capital directly through unwaged labor. That wasn't the case until now. Capital goods were industrial goods produced using proletarian labor. Now you and I are producing for free, the cloud capital of the cloudalists. You see, once you get a mutated form of capital, replacing markets with something which is not a market, once profit is no longer the vehicle of wealth accumulation and the rent or cloud rent takes over, once you have the state that comes in and stabilizes the macroeconomy, an increasingly unstable macroeconomy, by printing money through quantitative easing. Once you have capital being produced directly by unwaged people, that's no longer capitalism, folks. Welcome to Techno-Feudalism. That's what I'm saying. But it's a purely Marxist analysis of what went down.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think you already put all the elements of the answer for the next question on the table. Because if we today have a post-capitalism that is clearly not socialism, even though there was a moment post-financial crisis when the tumbling system has been saved by some, I mean, Slavoj Žižek has called it a socialism for the rich at one moment. Capitalism now has been overcome without of the promises the traditional left has identified this with this very overcoming, right? Or everything which was sort of imaginarily related to the end of capitalism has not materialized. So one could refer to the book by Mackenzie Wark, Capital is Dead. Is this something worse? And we might immediately answer yes. But we would like to discuss some of the details that you just put on the table here with you again.
Before we do that, let me make one comment, because Mackenzie Wark's book is great. I love it. But there is one point of disagreement with me that we have. I don't think capital is dead. I think capital is stronger than ever. Why? Because it has mutated to cloud capital. What is dead is capitalism. That is the small difference I have with Mackenzie's work. Please continue.
Yeah, no. I think, I mean, the line that you just a moment ago gave, the capital killed capitalism, right? So in some sense, capitalism is this, well, it thrives on corn sometimes, right? I mean, it goes on even though it seems to be impossible to go on. So it lives on even if one thinks, well, it is this mortifying or deadening le vif ceci, le mort ceci le vif, as Marx put it, right? I mean, there's a mortification going on. And so can we discuss in a little bit more detail the transition that you described? Because we were wondering if this move from profit to this new form of rent that you right now describe as cloud rent taken out by the cloudalists, and this, let's say, overcoming of traditional exploitation by strangely voluntary free labor that produces value, right? In this paradoxical sense that even if we say we do some consciousness raising and tell people about it, this does not lead to any form of emancipation into it.
Because we do it using their cloud capital, they're
Exactly.
reproducing it at the same time.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about how this effectively affects the logic of capital, if at all? Because for Marx describes it in terms of self-valorizing value, or in a slightly different formulation, as a value begetting more value, right? In other words, how would you say that techno-feudalism affects the structure of surplus production and realization, if it does affect it at all, or just the realization part, such that it overturns and overthrows the organization of previous capitalist political economy?
Of course it affects it. Look, allow me to start by explaining why the introduction of cloud capital and this transition from what I call the transition from capitalism to techno-feudalism is really terrible news for humanity. One of the great contributions of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels was to point out the contradiction of capital. I mean, you can read this in the Communist Manifesto in the first glorious 5 pages. At once, you know, the accumulation of capital liberated us from the greatest superstitions, from the ancien regime, from the stupidity of rural life, from the stupidity of feudalism, and at the same time created gigantic iron fences behind which we were imprisoned. So this is the dialectical celebration and condemnation of the role of capital accumulation. The same thing needs to be done today. Capitalism, before techno-feudalism, created gigantic quantities of wealth and simultaneously new forms of depravity and of poverty, which never existed before. You know, the depravity of the working class in England that Friedrich Engels described in his famous first book, that had never been experienced before in humanity. Human beings had never been so unhappy as they were as proletarians in Manchester. Back then, perhaps now as well. Okay. And then Keynes comes in, or if you want to bring in a Marxist version of Keynes, Michal Kalecki, and takes Marxist thought further by pointing out the incongruity involved in, you know, a ruling class which knows what it needs to do to stabilize capitalism, but it's in its interest never to see it through, because if they stimulate enough the economy, then they reduce their capacity to exploit the proletariat. Now, the macroeconomic system we live in is far more volatile and far more unstable and destabilized than capitalism was before 2008. Why? Because cloud capital does not produce surplus value. That's a purely Marxist idea, since it's a produced means of behavioral modification and not of production. Cloud capital does not produce value. What it produces is the power the oligarchic techno-feudal power, to steal value that has been produced in the ever-shrinking capitalist sector. So in my appendix, for instance, there's even a diagram. There is a capitalist sector which is now no longer central to the system's power creation model generator, but the whole system of power which dominates our lives, the techno-feudal system, it can only survive as a parasite on this ever-shrinking capitalist sector. In a way that is not new, because the capitalist sector, after the Great Transformation, after the Industrial Revolution, remained parasitic on the rural feudal sector. Without food, there would be no industry, no railways, no ships, right? But now, that's even more, because the more successful cloud capital it is at, for instance, attracting the best engineers to Facebook, right? These people are not available to the productive sector. The more successful cloud capital is at attracting skilled labor, educated labor, great minds to itself, the greater the shrinking process of the old-fashioned capitalist sector, which cloudalists, the techno-feudal order, requires in order to skim the surplus value off. So then the state comes in, and because aggregate demand, to use a Keynesian term, shrinks, because let's face it, when people are no longer employed, or they have bullshit jobs because algorithms are replacing them, then aggregate demand shrinks. And aggregate demand is essential for capitalist accumulation both of traditional capital and cloud capital. So the state comes in and needs to print money. So that's another non-capitalist dependence on the capitalist techno-feudal system, right? So we are fucked as a species, to put it in non-philosophical terms. If the greatest minds, the most powerful form of capital, the greatest concentration of power revolves around a sector which is not productive and which is shrinking the capacity of itself to reproduce itself. And then, one of the reasons why I'm really very scared about the possibility that the new Cold War between the United States and China is going to explode as a thermonuclear confrontation is this.
Thank you so much for this, Yanis. As you write, and I'm quoting, humanity is now being taken over by something that I can only describe as a technologically advanced form of feudalism, end quote. The famous and previous structural dichotomy of socialism or barbarism appears to be suspended today after alternating between capitalist barbarism or socialist barbarism, which left us with tautological choice between capitalist barbarism or barbaric capitalism, with techno-feudalism as a new player in the pitch, so to speak. Late capitalism was bad enough as it was, and manifested in the explosions of climate change, wars all over the place, profound inequalities, and so on. Where do you see the main difference between capitalism and techno-feudalism? Because you're asking is this because if we understand you well, when you talk about techno-feudalism, you're clearly not talking about new form of or new variation within capitalism, say like neoliberalism or something like that.
I never believed that there was such a thing as neoliberalism between you and I. I mean, neoliberalism was simply a term that people used loosely in order to refer to the ideological cover of financialization after the 1971 demise of the Bretton Woods system. It was neither new nor liberal, nor interesting philosophically, a hodgepodge of all ideas put together in order to justify reducing tax rates for the rich and letting the bankers go mad. Go berserk. That's what neoliberalism was. Look, when Rosa Luxemburg put us in front of the very poignant question, socialism or barbarism or socialism. The way I understood it was that essentially, because Rosa was that kind of person, she was not a dogmatic thinker, right? She was perfectly capable of questioning her own assumptions. She was saying that, look, guys, it's not just capitalism or socialism. We may end up with barbarism. I'm sure she didn't have a science fiction mindset, but, you know, there's Mad Max as well. You could end up with Mad Max or The Matrix, which is, you know, beyond capitalism and beyond socialism. And to assume that, you know, I grew up thinking that after capitalism we will certainly have socialism, but it didn't happen. And something worse than capitalism came on as a reaction to the fact that the socialist project died. And it died in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because whatever your opinion about the Soviet Union is, or was, whether you were in favor of it, or you believe that it was salvageable, that it could be democratized, or we thought it was beyond salvation, 1991 was the moment when we of the left were defeated globally. And even the Social Democrats, even the Italian Communist Party that disowned the Soviet Union, condemning them for dogmatism, for the Gulag, and so on and so forth, they all just went to the ground. Social democracy, the way it existed up until 1991, no longer exists. The Italian Communist Party, look at them, pathetic lot. We here on the left in Greece, we are just, in tatters.
So if one could say that feudalism was a form of direct social domination, like your lord would potentially whip you, and this clearly marks the difference to capitalism, where domination becomes impersonal, to refer to the famous argument by Moishe Cousteau. So the idea is, right, it's not the capitalist whipping you, but it's rather, I don't know, the need to pay your rents and for food and so forth that forces you into certain employments, and right. I mean, so it is structural or impersonal form of domination. We wanted to ask you what determines and characterizes, and I think you already pointed out, I think, quite some essential features. What characterizes the form of social domination, techno-feudalism? So certainly it's part of, let's say, the free labor analysis that we talked about, but also, I mean, what is the form of domination?
It's more or less as you put it in terms of capitalism. So this is where, for instance, this is one of the reasons why I'm saying this is not a return to feudalism, because that aspect of capitalism, which is, the alienation in Marxist terms, the alienation of the oppressed, who don't even know they are oppressed, because they have this sensation, this illusion of freedom, free to choose and free to lose under capitalism. This is now far worse. This is far, far worse than the techno-feudalism. Because, I mean, look at, the millions of kids who are working every day feverishly to replenish the cloud capital of TikTok, of Instagram, of YouTube. You and I doing it. Huh? And in a sense, it is liberating. When I tweet something and 100,000 people like it, and this is an essential part of the struggle against apartheid in Israel, right? I don't feel oppressed at that moment. I feel enabled. But of course, Elon Musk is the one who reaps the cloud rents for it. Okay. So you really must be a dedicated Marxist to see any degree of exploitation in what is the purest form of exploitation, free labor to produce capital goods for somebody who sits there getting rich in his sleep. So that's one example. Another example is the detrimental effect of cloud capital on what little personal liberty capitalism allowed us to have. Because, especially after the trades unions imposed the 8-hour day and certain worker protections, you could say that up until, 10, 15 years ago, there was a dividing line between your professional life and your personal space and your private time. So, you went to work from 9 to 5, you came home, the rest of the day was yours. Now this is no longer the case, and you don't even realize it. It's not just that people have to do work all the time and answer emails. That was always more or less the case. This kind of it's the voluntary servitude aspect of it. So that hit me some time ago. I remember, before my parliament and ministry days, I remember talking to youngsters, students of mine, graduate students or undergraduate students, and noticing a new kind of angst which never existed before. Because of social media, because of Facebook, because of Twitter, and especially now TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and all the other apps, surreptitiously, subconsciously, they know that they are leaving a trail, a digital trail of themselves on the internet. They know that when the time comes to be interviewed for a decent job, not just at Google, if they aspire to work for Google, but anywhere, the interviewer is going to check their social media profile before even deciding to shortlist them. And these days, it's an AI bot that will do it. It won't even be a human being. So, which means that without even thinking about it, every time they put something up on the video, even a photograph of their friends, of their dog, of their cat on the internet, they try to curate a personality in accordance to their expectation of the employer's expectation in 5 years' time. So essentially, there's no time for themselves. This is no time to curate themselves on their behalf, but they're curating themselves on behalf of a capitalist. Now that, if Marx were to hear that, he would have gone crazy. He would have said, that's the end of any kind of consumer sovereignty, of laborer sovereignty. So in a sense, techno-feudalism is a greater encroachment of what is left within us, which makes us us.
Let's move to a slightly different domain. What kind of politics is possible today? There have been 2 elections in a row in America that amount to, do you want Trump to be a president or not? Certainly, it does not seem like the 2-party system is really operative here. And this may point to what has been described as a certain exhaustion of a parliamentary system. One way to see this would be to see this election as an election with 2 choices. A vote for Trump is definitely a vote against the Democrats. It's a vote against what people now see as a powerful status quo. And a vote for Democrats, whether people like them or not, is a vote against Trump, who is seen as someone who could actually be a historical as a president, someone who could open up possibilities, even if only for the worst in the political field. Maybe we should take the Democrats for their word. We don't want change. We don't want to go back. We don't want to go forward. Everyone on both sides knows that the vote for the Democrats is a vote for things to stay the same. On the other hand, the new right of Trump, of his MAGA project, is to harken back to a historical motive which justifies their conservatism. The paradox of Democrats is that their idea of progress, of being on the right side of history, is basically to remain the same. This is how confused the field seems to be. But business as usual is today also rather unusual business. What is your analysis of what is going on and what is at stake at the US election? And what does this tell us about the status of contemporary parliamentary democracy?
To begin with, there is no democracy. Democracy lasted 2-3 decades, very briefly in ancient Athens, amongst men and citizens. It was a real democracy amongst men, in the sense that it was the only opportunity that the poor ever had to rule a state. Because there was no representative democracy, everybody had a vote. And that's why Aristotle and Plato hated democracy, because, as Aristotle put it, it's a system of government where the poor, because they're the majority, rule. But that only lasted 20 years, 30 years. It didn't include women, metics, or slaves. What we now have as democracy is the child or the grandchild of the Magna Carta, which is a deal between oligarchs, barons and kings and so on, dividing amongst themselves the right to exploit everybody else. And the beauty of the American Constitution is that in the name of democracy, it keeps the demos out. And it was planned to do that. Anybody who's read the Federalist Papers that are the foundation, the philosophical foundation of the American Constitution knows that that was the intention. It was not that the American democracy degenerated. Its purpose was to ensure that the demos was not allowed anywhere near the levers of democracy. And they've succeeded in that. So we have oligarchy, very harsh oligarchy, with periodic elections that legitimize it. Now, as Marxists, we must always try to find the contradictions in the system and seek ways of undermining it, using and utilizing and exploiting its contradictions. So here in Greece in 2015, we had an opportunity. When we got elected, we had an opportunity to blow the whole thing up. And that's why those of us who remain faithful to that opportunity were so demonized by the establishment, by the system, because they got really scared that people who wanted to blow up the system were inside the system, even for 5 minutes. In the United States, the last opportunity there was in 2016 when Bernie Sanders got close. He was robbed by Hillary Clinton and the DNC. And I very much fear that Bernie Sanders made a huge mistake, one for which history is going to condemn him. And I'm saying this as a friend. He should have created a third party before the 2016 election. He had 900,000 committed activists. You don't just junk them and say, okay, vote for Hillary Clinton, or don't even say that. Allow them to go to ground, and then 4 years later try again. Gone. So I really am indifferent when it comes to these elections. Look at the French elections. I mean, who gives a damn how many MPs the Popular Front got? And I'm very critical of the Popular Front. I like them, they're my friends. But, if you look at their program, if it were to be implemented in France today, would lead to a clash with Brussels, like the one I experienced. But they're not saying this to the people. How can you do that? You've got to prepare the people for the clash, for the rupture, if you're going to implement your program, unless you don't want to implement your program, in which case, what the hell are you doing? So I am totally bored by these elections because, they don't change anything. And if a result, if the outcome of the election is not suiting the interests of the establishment, they will ignore it and have another one, as they kept doing. Regarding the United States situation now, permit me to say that, okay, to begin with, the differences between Trump and Kamala is not as great as it is presented. You must never take these people on their word. When Donald Trump was going on about how Wall Street destroyed Middle America and how he would drain the swamp and essentially chase the bankers out of America if he were to be president, and then he becomes president, and what does he do? He takes the CEO of Goldman Sachs and makes him finance minister, secretary of the Treasury, which is exactly what Obama did. So let's not get too carried away with this phony opposition. There is a difference, however. I think that, look, I dread Trump's election for women, girls, brown people, the working class that he claims he cares. They will be thoroughly targeted, and they will see their life prospects diminish, especially if you're a woman, and especially if you're a brown woman. So Trump, especially his neo-fascist vice president, J.D. Vance, who is a complete fascist. If you read what he's written and what he has said, he's a fascist. There's no doubt about that. So they will be a disaster for Americans, right? Kamala would be a disaster for Europe because the Democrats are gung-ho about continuing the Ukraine war forever. They don't want anybody to win. They just want it to go on and on and on because it is their way of maintaining their hold over Europe, essentially. Trump would end that war. And I don't think he would start a war against Iran. And he wouldn't allow the confrontation with China to spill over. So it's, stuffed if you do, stuffed if you don't. If Harris wins, then Americans will be slightly better off, especially if they're women or members of minorities or working class people. And if Kamala wins, then war is closer everywhere you are. So the answer to your question, what kind of politics do we want? Well, I've tried to answer this question through what I do. Not that I'm doing it with any degree of serious success. But, in Europe, we've created DiEM25, which is the Democracy in Europe movement. It is a transnational movement. Essentially, what we're saying is that either you're going to have a transnational, not even internationalist, because internationalism has failed. Why? Because international is like a federation between parties. That doesn't work. I mean, you meet once a year or every 2 years, you scratch each other's backs, then you go home and you do national politics. It doesn't work. So DiEM25, we're all in it as Europeans, even non-Europeans are in it. We have people in the Middle East who are members, people in Canada and the United States. We don't respect borders. And we're in there, as progressives, as socialists. We're not there as Greeks or Germans and so on. Also, Bernie and I started something called the Progressive International in 2018. Bernie since then has been doing other things, but we have continued with that. So speaking of Techno-Feudalism, every Black Friday in December, we stage a worldwide strike against Amazon. It's called #MakeAmazonPay. You may have seen that. That's Progressive International behind that. We're trying to, we're using this as a test case, as a pilot program for a new kind of collective action, which is transnational. It's cross-border, and it combines two things at once. Conventional industrial strikes, so workers working for Amazon are striking, beginning in Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Germany, New Jersey, Seattle, as the sun moves, and a consumer boycott of Amazon, because we think that this should be the new model of collective action internationally, from an internationalist Marxist perspective. That's the kind of politics that I want to see. We're very far off realizing it, but at least we're making an effort.
Thank you, Yanis. I mean, to speak about another, let's say, aspect maybe of the bleakness of our contemporary situation politically, you have repeatedly stated that Europe is politically dead, and without this even mildly international, not even to say internationalist, but project being mortified, not only nationalism seemed to grow everywhere, but they even take on a particularly or peculiar, maybe even novel form, because they form like an international of nationalisms. Maybe one could call it
the
like
nationalist international, as I call it.
Exactly. And just recently, the AfD gained a huge electoral success in Germany's Thuringia, and in France, it can seem as if Le Pen's victory is only a matter of time. And right now, with the Macron move, right, I mean, this is already infiltrating government construction right now. And just to refer to these examples and not to what's coming in Austria, what's already the case in Hungary, and so forth. I mean, you know the situation as well as we do, and better. I mean, so this to say the European political conjuncture could hardly look any more depressing. So depressing that even saying that Europe has already lost its global political relevance and will remain nothing but a mere tourist attraction seems too optimistic today, maybe. Do you see any chance for a rebirth of Europe? And is that something that you think is a political question? Or do we need a rebirth of something else before anything politically relevant can be imagined at all in Europe? So we're asking this question because you earlier on, but also you state this in Techno-Feudalism, you envisage or anticipate a new Cold War between US and China, and that could spiral out of control. And we were wondering if you see any, let's say, political role that Europe could play in this new Cold War.
As things stand, no. The reason why I connect the new Cold War, and which may turn into a hot war, with the Techno-Feudalism is because, I take its logical conclusion my thesis. If my thesis is right, I'm not saying it's right, if it is right, that cloud capital is the instrument of power these days, who owns cloud capital? Europe doesn't. It's the United States and it's China. And for me, I don't know whether our audience has ever asked themselves the question, why is there a clash between the United States and China now? There wasn't one until recently, until 2015, 2016. There wasn't one. So what's happening now? All iPhones are being produced in China. So why are the Americans having a problem? Why is Apple having a problem? Apple doesn't have a problem with China. But why is the Washington cabal, why are they so gung-ho against China? And I think it's got to do with the fact that this cloud capital has allowed Chinese finance and Chinese big tech to merge and to create a potential alternative to the dollar payment system. And the dollar payment system is the only reason why the United States remains so dominant, so hegemonic. Why can't they have one in the United States? It's not technological. The problem is not technological. You know, if anything, they're more advanced than the Chinese so far. The reason is political. Wall Street will never allow big tech to share its capacity to print money. Whereas in China, big finance and big tech under the Communist Party have no opportunity but to collaborate. And that puts the dollar payment system under threat. So this is why Biden upped the ante. Trump had started the Cold War slightly, and then Biden turbocharged it. Why? Because of that. Regarding Europe, look, Europe has been wrecked by the euro. The creation of the common currency, which was meant to be a first step towards a federation, was never going to work. There was a Cambridge economist, Nicholas Kaldor, in the 1970s, who was so prescient when he wrote in 1971 an article in the New Statesman in which he warned Europeans, don't try to form a monetary federation so as to bring about a political federation, because if you create a monetary union without a political and fiscal union, that will create much, much greater capitalist crisis in Europe, and that will turn one people against the other, a people against themselves, and then they will never be able to federate. And he was not heard. And then when exactly that happened in 2009, 2010, with the, following the Wall Street collapse, and, the epicenter of that was, ground zero was Greece, but then it was Portugal, Ireland, and so on. That was a great opportunity for European leaders, European elites, European bourgeoisies, European ruling classes to say, okay, we made a mistake, we'll start again, or we will federate now, or we will do away with the euro, but, do something about this catastrophe. They didn't. They used massive force. What they did here in Greece was a coup d'etat against people who said, we can't take this illogicality anymore. And they printed mountain ranges of money and used it as cortisone administered to a cancer patient. So the whole thing looked as if it was stabilized, but the cancer, the tumor was doing its untold business under the surface. And the result now is that Europe is a stupid continent. Europe, as a result of this crisis, we haven't had investment on this continent for 15 years. So we missed then the fourth industrial revolution, effectively green energy, electric cars, and so on. And there's no way we can catch up now. Germany is finished. The German industrial model is kaput, gone. And their usual ways of reducing wages and introducing austerity, that can't help you catch up technologically if you're not investing in it. It's the opposite. It will shrink investment even further. So it's not an accident that there is no Angela Merkel anymore. Angela Merkel, she wasn't a particularly smart person. She wasn't stupid. She was quite capable. But, the reason why there was a German chancellor that actually ruled the roost across Europe was because Europe maintained its industrial might. But now, after all those years of not investing due to the idiotic crisis and the inevitable crisis of an idiotic system, Macron is gone. He was never able capable of steering Europe anyway. He tried to lead Europe, but nobody paid any attention, because if you're a deficit country, you can't lead. So the only serious surplus country is Germany, but Germany is now kaput, and you can see that in Olaf Scholz, a man who cannot even command his own cabinet. And then we used to have a north-south divide in Europe, which was very harsh. Now we have an east-west divide as well. So, and ask yourself the question that I ask people. Imagine that tomorrow there is a UN-sponsored peace process for Ukraine, and everybody's in it. So, Zelensky is there, Putin is there, Biden or whoever follows up from Biden, Modi, Xi are there. Who will represent Europe? You just ask this question and you despair. You just despair. There's no one. None who either can or who has the legitimacy to do it. So Europe is finished. We're just finished. So what must we do? Well, transnationalism. A transnational progressive socialist movement is the only thing that can work at the global level to end this constant defeat of our species, in both environmentally and socially and economically and morally, and Europe. It's not looking good, though, folks. That doesn't mean we must stop trying, but let's be honest.
Yes. So the very last question. We end our podcast with a series of either-or questions. So you can obviously reject the choice. You can elaborate on it if you choose to. Okay. So can we begin? First, revolution or democracy?
To get democracy, we need a revolution. Otherwise, it's impossible.
The second one, freedom or discipline?
To get freedom, you need discipline. And if you have discipline without freedom, you might as well die.
The third one, socialism or communism?
Communism. Communism. The idea that we go through socialism first, in order to reach communism. Now we have Amazon has given us the algorithm by which to have central planning with adaptive expectations and a perfectly functioning system.
Optimism or pessimism?
Pessimism. And hope. Because optimism is the idiot's variety of hope.
Taking power or undoing power?
Taking power to undo power.
6, classical music or pop rock?
Good rock is the best classical music, and the best classical music rocks. Pop sucks.
Yeah, we agree here. Opera or theater?
I would have to say theater, with moments of brilliance from the opera.
Films or series?
Once upon a time, I would say films, but now we're ending up in a world where more resources go into series, and series can be pretty good.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones?
Neither.
And the very last one, Yanis, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
A world in which I don't have to make a choice like this.
Thank you so much for
Thank
doing
you so
this.
much.
Thank you so much.